You will be shocked. The Magyar settles the score. Now everything Russia had is going to Ukraine. Zelenskyy is heading to Budapest, a historic moment that all of Europe is watching. You won't believe it. Our ballistic missiles hit the heart of Russia and caused such a stir that the world stood still. The AFU's superweapon has surpassed everyone. The Americans didn't even know that missiles could do such a thing. Nuclear weapons are no longer a threat. Shocking! Moscow has turned into a beggar. The war has consumed everything. The Russians are ready to tear Putin to pieces for this. Meanwhile, the AFU is driving the occupiers out of Transnistria. It thundered so loudly that everyone heard it. There's no point in waiting any longer. Moldova is one step away from a triumphant return of its territories. NATO's second-largest army is on standby. A rift has opened up between Turkey and Israel. And Russia is the one who started it. All this and more in our episode of Hell Point. Finally, the moment of truth has arrived. Zelenskyy is going to Budapest. The Magyar has made an urgent appeal to Ukraine. The first decisions have been announced. They sound like an open verdict for Moscow. Hungary is now siding with the Ukrainians and is finally providing funds. This is a true triumph for Kyiv. Europe has frozen in anticipation. Budapest and Brussels are finally shaking hands. Moscow's snares have been torn apart. A mega explosion is brewing that will finally wipe the RF off the continent. Don't miss it.
Don't miss it.
We are very happy that Orban is finally leaving after all this time.
We didn't believe this could happen.
We're glad that hope has finally appeared. We've changed the system.
Hungary is recovering after the opposition's phenomenal victory in the parliamentary elections. And the future Prime Minister, Péter Magyar, is already developing a large-scale plan to normalize relations with neighboring countries and within the European Union.
Even those who believed in Tisa's victory wondered if Magyar could change anything, because Orban has reconfigured the entire political system over these 16 years. But now that Tisa apparently has a constitutional majority in parliament, they can, in principle, change it.
So the new government's main stated priority is to unblock 18 billion euros from EU funds, frozen due to violations of democratic principles during the Orban era. But regaining Europe's favor turned out to be not so simple. They presented Magyar with nearly 30 conditions, the key one being the lifting of the veto on a 90 billion euro EU loan for Ukraine. He replied that he agreed.
A multi-billion-dollar loan for Ukraine. I don't understand what there is to talk about, because in December at the EU Council Summit, a decision was made to allocate 90 billion euros, in which Hungary, the Czech Republic and Slovakia will not participate. This doesn't concern us. And that's how it was decided. This decision was already made in December in Brussels, so I don't understand why it should be changed.
In addition, the new Hungarian government is being asked to finally decide whose side the country is on, and the indicator will be the vote for a new package of sanctions against Russia. Analysts predict that this will happen too. However, the Hungarian Prime Minister's rhetoric won't become too militant.
He'll do roughly what Pashinyan did in the Kremlin recently, that is, somehow mark his position, his priorities, but nevertheless not go for an outright break, because Magyar, like Pashinyan, remembers the example of Saakashvili. They remember the example of Georgia in the year 2008. And no one wants to go down that path.
Another EU condition regarding Ukraine was the demand to stop blocking the start of official negotiations on Ukraine's accession to the EU. And here, obviously, the bilateral relations between Kyiv and Budapest will be an important factor. Experts believe the picture will become clear after a personal meeting between Péter Magyar and Volodymyr Zelenskyy.
I don't rule out that these two politicians might have a lot in common. And these personal relationships, they could become such a push for Ukraine and Hungary to be able to, well, maybe if not become exactly like friends, but at least in general have very good relations.
Zelenskyy was the first to demonstrate his readiness to improve relations, stating the day before that by the end of the month, the Druzhba pipeline will be repaired and launched. Magyar said he's also ready for dialogue, but called for the resolution of issues that have long caused disputes between the states.
We will build allied relations with all neighboring countries. However, for example, in relations with Ukraine, the condition for their normalization will be the settlement of the rights of the Hungarian minority living there. I think this is clear to the Ukrainian leadership as well. Language rights, cultural rights, and other aspects of life must be settled.
Moscow, however, reacted very painfully to such a rapprochement. Despite millions of rubles invested in Orban's election campaign, their candidate lost miserably. And Magyar's first statements regarding unblocking the loan to Ukraine caused a shock, destroying the Kremlin's entire strategy in the war of attrition.
The decision which will be made in Brussels, we believe that any actions to continue fueling the militaristic and pro-war aspirations of the Kiev regime are steps that do not contribute to the search for a peaceful settlement.
In Europe, on the contrary, they are triumphant. Despite the conditions set by Budapest, the focus is on normalizing relations within the EU and the actions of the renewed parliament within the paradigm of the entire Union rather than against the rules, as Orban did before.
Personally, I feel gratitude and relief that the results of the parliamentary elections in Hungary yesterday turned out to be so clear. 2/3 of the votes. This shows that societies in our democratic countries, as it turns out, are still much more resilient to Russian propaganda and other attempts at external influence on such elections.
At the same time, experts believe that today Hungary faces two main threats. First, it's Orban's people, placed in all key positions in the country, who could hinder the new prime minister in his reforms. And second, the temptation that Péter Magyar faces today, because he is effectively gaining full power in the country. Will he be able to resist it? We will judge only by his actions.
Two things seem clear to me: that the Ukrainian loan will be unblocked, and that this slogan, well, again, coming from 1956, Russians go home, that it will still be implemented to some extent. Of course, Hungary simply cannot afford to give up its access to Russian energy resources. It will have to carefully maneuver and skillfully navigate this complex situation somehow. However, it is important to note that Hungary will no longer be just a puppet of Putin, as it once may have been.
A secret special operation of ours that everyone is talking about. A mysterious Ukrainian ballistic missile entered the Russian Federation unnoticed and turned off Moscow's key lever of influence. This is a real sensation. The Kremlin is at a loss. The moment of truth has finally arrived. The weapons of the armed forces of Ukraine are breaking all records. Even the Americans didn't think of this. Space forces and air defense capable of intercepting even a nuclear missile. The Russians found themselves on the desperate edge of a battle where the winner is already known. The first details are next. Ukraine has secretly developed missiles that can fly 500 kilometers deep into Russia. This is reported by Defense Express experts analyzing the statement of Deputy Péter Venislavsky. This refers in particular to the development of hypersonic ballistic missiles. Analysts suggest such systems already exist, although their number is limited. Exactly when and against which targets they were used is currently unknown.
If such launches took place, I don't rule out that they could have been in completely different parts of the globe, and they wouldn't be related to Ukraine's tests at all. Although the story itself, which involves the secret and highly confidential launch of 2 or even more missiles to such extraordinary and impressive altitudes, all without any kind of publicity or public announcement, well, it certainly causes some genuine amazement and surprise among people. And if this ambitious endeavor actually succeeded, then it would naturally inspire admiration and respect, because it strongly confirms and reinforces the status of our state, not only as a nation with advanced aircraft building and engine building capabilities, but also as a country that is actively reclaiming and restoring everything that they, or rather that we once had in terms of space exploration and the pursuit of new frontiers beyond our planet.
One of the areas that is actively developing is the so-called air launch. During the war, Ukraine has already tested launching a carrier rocket from a transport plane at an altitude of about 8,000 meters. This approach allows bypassing the most difficult part of the flight, the dense layers of the atmosphere, and potentially increasing the strike range. Such technology can also be used to put satellites into orbit, and this is already part of a much larger strategy to create our own space infrastructure.
The trajectories of such missiles pass at altitudes of over 100 kilometers, which effectively places them in outer space. At the same time, Ukraine's current air defense systems operate at lower altitudes of up to 30 to 40 kilometers. Therefore, the issue of the need to create the space forces of the armed forces of Ukraine aims, in particular, at the legalization of the armed forces' activities in a new military domain, space.
It is also known as MP Fédyr Venislavsky states that Ukraine plans to form a sovereign satellite constellation for communication, reconnaissance, and early warning of missile attacks. Currently, these functions are largely provided by partners, but dependence on external data is a risk that Kyiv wants to minimize.
The Russian Federation still cannot create an engine of the same type as the one created at Yuzhmash for launching various types of rockets, a powerful engine. But not only the Russians can't do it, the Americans can't do it either because, well, by and large, an engine, a liquid propellant rocket engine, is a very great art. In the field of engine building for space technology, Ukraine is still unsurpassed.
Ukraine also plans to deploy its own means of kinetic interception of fractional orbital missile systems like the Oreshnik even before their warheads separate in space. It is also about creating a separate branch of space forces. This is necessary in particular for working in a new military sphere, as modern ballistic missiles can rise to an altitude of over 100 kilometers effectively into space. At the same time, Ukrainian air defense today effectively operates at much lower altitudes.
If we're talking about it, the Israeli system suits us better in principle, but still, to develop it, it took about 8 years and it took about $7 billion. When we say that we are engaged in this business, it means we have such resources and we are investing these resources into this whole undertaking, into this research, into this development.
In parallel, Ukraine is also ramping up other technologies. Every day, up to 1,500 interceptor drones are produced in the country. Ukrainian military personnel are also setting technological records. A soldier from the presidential brigade with the call sign Hulk was able to destroy 2 enemy Shahed-type drones at a distance of 500 kilometers from the launch site. Such a shootdown is unique and a world first. The Ukrainian defense industry is moving to a new level, from drones to ballistics and space. And although many developments remain classified, one thing is clear: the technological war is becoming key.
Sensation: the rose-colored glasses that Putin put on Russia have finally come off. Now the dictator's flattering words that everything is under control no longer work. Russians are falling into an abyss and the landing will be very painful. The war is devouring the Kremlin. Wallets are emptier than ever. Only poverty lies ahead. Russians are already openly saying that the bunker man will pay for this. Will the lack of money finally force Moscow to rise up against the regime? Let's watch. While the Russian economy loses billions due to sanction isolation, Putin lives in a fictional world of success.
Russia must be what? Strong. You and I talk about this constantly. In person, constantly.
At public events, the Kremlin dictator claims that Russia is successfully overcoming sanctions and becoming a global economic leader.
It will be calmer that way, it will be cheaper to live, and it will be possible to create better conditions for development and economic growth.
But in reality, this development remains in the distant past. Western sanctions have already caused significant damage to Russia's economy and will continue to limit its capabilities. However, Putin receives distorted data about the state of his country's economy. This is stated in a report by the Latvian Constitution Protection Bureau.
Now that there are no opposition media left in Russia, there is nothing that could get into his folders and have a sufficiently critical tone, because simply no one would risk putting anything critical into that folder. Anything critical must always have a signature, and today no one will provide that signature.
According to Latvian intelligence, from 2022 to 2025, Russia had to spend an additional $130 billion to purchase sanctioned Western goods through bypass schemes. By 2030, total losses from sanctions could amount to at least $136 billion, if not more.
Words that we have problems in the economy are just words. The statement by the Center for Macroeconomic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting, headed by Belousov Jr., the brother of Russian Defense Minister Belousov, that a recession is a normal thing, is again just words. But the decision by the Moscow mayor's office that staff will be reduced by 15%, The announcement that the Cabinet of Ministers will cut budget spending by 10%, those are no longer words, those are real actions. And so, against the backdrop of these actions, to say that everything is fine in the economy would be very foolish.
The report emphasizes that sanctions have already significantly hit the main sectors of the Russian economy. For example, iron exports decreased by 40%, ferrous metals by 20%, chemical products by 35%. Moreover, Russia has lost part of its Western markets and by 2024 has not been able to find a full replacement.
We have a picture, or rather Russia has, that more and more industries are now saying they have losses, more industries are turning to the state for help, and the state budget is not bottomless either. And plus on oil, well, right now there's a slight increase, but the first 2 months were negative, and this budget deficit that has accumulated, let me remind you, in 2 months of 2024, the Russian budget deficit is 3.4 trillion rubles. To put it in perspective, for the 12 months of the current year, they planned 3.8 trillion.
A crisis in Russia could flare up at any moment, as even now most Russian regions are reporting a lack of funds even for a priority expenditure item, paying contracts for military personnel going to the war against Ukraine.
There is what people see every day. There literally, I think today or yesterday, Sberbank went down its online platform, and accordingly, because the internet periodically doesn't work, people can't pay by card in the store, not to mention the rise in prices. That is the fact that the economy, the whole economy is constantly failing. Every person sees this when they go to the store, take transport, and generally perform any action within their city or village.
Money is running out, but ambitions remain. Putin is ready to continue exhausting the economy to prolong his aggressive policy and war. Right now, an explosion has occurred in Transnistria. Tension is rising sharply. The Kremlin is again trying to destabilize the situation and draw Moldova into the game, opening another front of tension. Ukraine is reacting instantly. The armed forces of Ukraine are already on standby. Together with Chisinau, scenarios are being worked out that could thwart these plans. There's a feeling of a tough response in the air that could change the rules of the game. What will happen next and how far will this go? The first forecasts are already appearing. Don't miss it.
The Kremlin plans to create a buffer zone in the Vinnytsia region from the side of Transnistria. Such a statement was made in a recent interview by the deputy head of the president's office, Pavlo Palisa. The brigadier general spoke about the plans for the Russian spring-summer campaign, among which the occupiers are for the first time considering the creation of a buffer zone in the Vinnytsia region.
The Russians even have a point in their plans to create a buffer zone in the Vinnytsia region from the side of unrecognized Transnistria. This is the first time plans of this nature have been recorded. Pavlo Palisa, Brigadier General of the Armed Forces of Ukraine.
The danger from Transnistria has been discussed since the start of the full-scale invasion. The armed forces are ready for provocations by the Russian contingent in Transnistria, and revealing the plan is a preventive measure that robs the enemy of the element of surprise.
There is indeed a Russian military contingent and a pro-Russian population in Transnistria, which Putin could use to create extra tension and distract Ukrainian forces from other areas. Citizens should take such information calmly and take constructive action, be more vigilant, prepare the local population for potential threats, and support the country's defense readiness. Ivan Timokko, military observer.
In specific regions, buffer zones, and the capture of, say, Odessa and Mykolaiv. So these are all just, fantasies of the Russian Federation. They have voiced them repeatedly. Putin voiced them at a meeting of the Ministry of Defense Board. That is, there are no reserves, no potential, and no systematic motivation. And he understands this himself.
Deputy head of the president's office, Palisa, explained that Russian plans still include creating a buffer zone in Kharkiv, Sumy, and Chernihiv regions, as well as attempts to seize Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. In the long term, they aim to carry out the seizure of the Mykolaiv and Odessa regions.
Undoubtedly, their main focus this year will be concentrated on the Donbass. And also, under favorable conditions, they will develop and increase efforts in the southern direction. This is the Oleksandrivsk and the entire Zaporizhzhia direction. Pavlo Palisa, Brigadier General of the Armed Forces of Ukraine.
Brigadier General Palisa also said that the occupiers are constantly changing their plans and deadlines because they lack the strength and means to execute them.
they announce these plans. Yes, as if preparing reserves to seize the Donetsk region, which has already, I'll say it plainly, been set as a goal dozens of times. We've noted repeatedly regarding Pokrovsk, 23 deadlines since September 2025, he's set to capture Pokrovsk. Currently, this has not been achieved. I'm not even talking about Donbass, let alone 5 regions of Ukraine. In other words, it's unrealistic.
Now, according to both Ukrainian and British intelligence, the armed forces have the best situation on the front in the last 10 months. Ukraine has an advantage in virtually all drones, and the number of Russian manpower destroyed exceeds the reserves being replenished. So there can be no talk of any buffer zone, especially in the Vinnytsia region.
Urgent, Turkey is starting a war. Erdogan shocked with sharp statements. NATO's second largest army has been put on high alert. The situation has reached a boiling point. Putin is applauding. Russia's hand is visible here too. Diplomacy came to its senses in time. The information attack has been suppressed. But will there be a new escalation? Be the first to know.
A new conflict is brewing in the Middle East. Tensions are rising there between Turkey and Israel. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu accused Turkish President Recep Erdogan of mass killings of his own Kurdish citizens and supporting Iran's terrorist regime and its proxies. In turn, Turkey's foreign ministry didn't hold back either, calling Netanyahu the Hitler of our time.
We see that Israel may seek to declare Turkey a new adversary after Iran, as it cannot exist without an enemy.
The ongoing animosity and tension between the two powerful and influential nations could, some military analysts say, eventually lead to open confrontation. The situation escalated further last weekend when many media outlets, citing the British publication The Telegraph, published reports that Erdogan allegedly even threatened to invade Tel Aviv, which immediately drew a sharp response from Israel's national security minister. It seemed that conflict was now inevitable. Turkey, which has the second largest army in the North Atlantic Alliance, will not tolerate this. However, as so often happens in the ongoing pursuit of dramatic and sensational headlines, the Western media, eager to be first with the story, jumped the gun. Instead of any actual military escalation or direct confrontation, both sides, for the time being, limited themselves only to exchanging mutual accusations and issuing verbal threats against each other, rather than taking concrete action.
We reject any scenario that drags a regional state into a destructive conflict.
Russia was particularly upset by the statement from the Turkish foreign minister. Kremlin propaganda has long dreamed of driving a wedge between two of Ukraine's allies. On one hand, Turkey, which did not recognize Putin's annexation of Crimea and continues to build a naval fleet for Kyiv, and on the other, Israel, which quietly assists the armed forces of Ukraine with weapons, intelligence, and its technology. If the two Middle Eastern rivals clashed in a dispute, all those weapons would be aimed not at the Russian occupiers, but toward Ankara and Tel Aviv. But fortunately, Erdogan and Netanyahu are not quite that reckless.
Turkey will continue to use all diplomatic tools to counter this. In today's world, the battlefield is not just physical, but informational as well. We live in an era where the narrative has become just as important and fiercely contested as real events on the ground. Narratives are used as weapons to shape perception, interpret reality, and all too often to hide the truth itself.
So, Israel and Turkey intend to fight exclusively in the informational and diplomatic fields.
Turkish-Israeli relations remain tense and inherently competitive, especially in the context of Israel's policy of encircling Turkey in the Mediterranean through cooperation with Greece and the Greek administration of southern Cyprus. In response, Turkey's growing influence in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel region, in both military and political spheres, creates space in Israel's rear and undermines this policy of encirclement. Thus, every step by one side triggers a counter-step by the other. The struggle continues.
So, a military conflict between Ankara and Tel Aviv is off the table, no matter how much some might want it. Yes, the Turkish Center for Combating Disinformation stated that claims that Erdogan is threatening Israel with an invasion are fake, and the sensational news from the Telegraph, which was widely circulated in the press, is based on material and statements by Erdogan made 2 years ago and taken out of context. By the way, at this moment, the material from the publication's website has also already been deleted.
That's all for now. I'm Darina Hutskalo. Even more hellish news in our next episode. Well, for now, don't forget to subscribe and like. See you!